Good afternoon, Eurosatory. I hope you're all having a good and productive day. I'm here now with Christyn CIANFARANI, who is president of the Canadian Association of Defence and Security Industries. We're going to talk a little bit about the Canadian defence industry and its role in the wider strategic context right now. Christyn, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy. Could you start off by describing the size and the composition of the Canadian delegation here today for us?
Of course. So it's going to seem small by comparison since this is a giant show, but there are almost 200 Canadians floating around this show. The number of companies we have with us, some are in our pavilion and some are outside. They fly by different flags. There are about 70 Canadian firms here at the show. Which is a very large delegation for us. In the past, in 2022, we had about 50. So we're up, and I think the attendance at the show is up as well. And in our pavilion, we've got about 23 businesses that have come with us.
Okay, wow. And is there a kind of a core speciality that is common across them, or are they quite spread out across domains and capabilities?
They're spread out across domains. What I can say is our pavilion largely sweeps up the smaller firms. So the small businesses, generally under 250 people, are with us in the pavilion. Our larger firms, which would be, the subsidiaries of foreign primes, big, large contractors, those you'll find throughout the show, generally flying the flag. If they have a European global footprint, they'll be flying that flag. So a very good example would be Thales, for example, will be here under the French flag. General Dynamics Land Systems, that has a huge head office in Canada, is actually here under, I think they're in their own pavilion with the UK. So we see that kind of thing happening.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's a logical breakdown. And what are the most interesting products and technologies, or perhaps even services, to come out of the Canadian defence industry? And I think the services and technologies in particular, the development of them is one area that is growing, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's preoccupation in the industry, I think, with innovation. So we've got kind of a two-pronged thing happening. You've got the conventional defense industry, which we all, I think, know and love. But there are interesting things being pushed into the conventional defense side. So, very good example is Canada has a huge competency in armor and armor vehicles, and some of the push coming out of the things that we've learned in Ukraine are pushing those technologies. We're also seeing that confluence of electric vehicles and climate action pushing into the military domain space. So militaries themselves want to do greening, and we're seeing that pushing into the armored vehicle side. So that's one side of the conventional side. The other thing that we see in Canada, because of our proximity to the United States, but not uniquely, is whatever is sort of the fancy of the Americans and the American prime platforms also sort of drives us, because we're considered part of their industrial base. So in the case of either NORAD or AUKUS, the coalition, we're seeing a lot of interest in things like hypersonics, artificial intelligence, the buzzword quantum computing and encryption, and the softwares that go with it. So there's a very large demographic in Canada that came out in the 90s from the sort of the BlackBerry Nortel years, and that's been sitting there on the commercial side, and we're now seeing it sort of pull even more further into the defense space. So what would be almost like a little sleeper cell of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, was always there in Canada a lot longer than perhaps in many other nations, and now we're seeing kind of a rebirth of that.
That's really interesting, and I think one of the keys to innovation is having a lot of different hubs, the different clusters, right, that can work together. But I'm curious if you can talk to us a bit about the Canadian military strategy around AI? Have they been able to issue any guidance that drives it? Because it's certainly a challenge in the UK.
No, I mean, we've just even started just having an AI strategy within Canada, right? So even at a sort of, let's call it industrial or not necessarily national security level, but we aren't even getting to the conversation, to your point about perhaps regulation of AI or its uses of AI on the battlefield. And I think the sad part is the horse is kind of out of the barn on that, right? And so I think Canada tends to not be a first mover on these things. We'd most likely be looking at our partners in the US or UK in the Five Eyes to be sort of leaning forward on it. I don't know what to make of it, to be honest with you. Certainly, we're not in conversations where we hear them talking about how they might regulate it or how it might start to look on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's plenty here to guide.
We could unpack that. Yeah.
What are the challenges that you see for the Canadian defence industrial base right now? And perhaps you've touched on it a little bit, but perhaps you could talk a bit about supply chains and that kind of thing, if that's...
Yeah, so I mean, challenges, there's two types. For sure, there's securing up supply chains. So the Americans are moving forward on cyber security certification level, which will basically sort of start to lock down supply chains. I think we're going to start to see that come more aggressively in the prime contractors. So as I mentioned to you, the landscape in Canada, because we have the Americans to the south, a lot of Canadian firms are within the global conglomerate supply chains. So think about it from, Canadian technologies within a Lockheed Martin product, for example. Right. When we start to get into the more mature models for cybersecurity, I think we're going to start to see a lockdown on those supply chains. So it's going to become harder to get into some of these firms. On the flip side, Canada is a trusted sort of provider. So I think if we do it right and we make sure that we're first movers for on the CMMC certification, which we as a nation are working to have a certification model that is both applicable for Canada and the United States, then it would be an advantage for Canadian firms, right? Yeah. So we're looking at that from a pre-positioning point of view. The second sort of challenge I think that we're facing globally is the challenge kind of still that we see coming out of the Ukraine, which is we have a global show. It's called CANSEC, and our tagline this year, it happened 2 weeks ago, our tagline this year was "Move at the Speed of Life." And I think we're still seeing, particularly in Canada, but not uniquely, challenges in the 2 Ps, I call it. So the procurement challenge, the ability to procure at the speed of life or in a more agile way, which comes back to how do you procure services and technologies that are bleeding edge, which refresh themselves in such a high pace. Yeah. And then secondly, P, the production side, which is, I still think the industrial base, whether in Canada or otherwise, still hasn't leaned out far enough to be able to produce at the size and scale for the war in Ukraine. And also how it will respond over time to the peaks and the inevitable valley that will come after the war is done. As you know, probably every board of directors is sitting there wondering, well, if this is the 50-year peak, what do we do when we hit the valley afterwards? And how do we sustain this new NATO production model into the 20 years into the future, right?
Yeah, I've definitely heard those conversations and been involved in some of them. I wonder as well if you would add a third P, perhaps, which is personnel.
Yes.
I spend my time, it's not a hobby, but researching Russian supply chains. And one of the things they're crying out for is personnel because they don't have the operatives. And I know in the UK and across Europe, the specialized personnel to build AI, just for example, not because it's the key, those people have the same skills to build AI for a defense application as they would need to go and create a driverless autonomous car.
Yeah.
Which obviously pays quite differently. So do you have sort of a perspective on that from a Canadian point of view?
Yeah, so there is, I think, a talent crunch in general, right? And then it becomes exacerbated. So if you look at it from an operator perspective, you have a recruitment and retention problem in the uniform side of it. And it becomes potentially even a less attractive market space. And then in the private sector, you have that same need for that talent. It could be the militarized version or the commercial version. And what we're seeing in Canada right now is almost like a cannibalization, where if you look at it holistically, there's not enough for any of us, right? And I think globally, every nation is starting to struggle with that, not just in the emerging technologies, but what we're realizing now, even from a NATO sustainment, is that there's a lot of duplication, and we can't afford that duplication. So I think, some of the notion behind these coalitions that's happening with respect to Ukraine is, and to some extent, the AUKUS Pillar 2s, are these attempts to say, we need to, as nations, decide on these priorities and then share information, talent, and maybe pool a little bit more, because right now it's too extreme for us to be able to do anything very well, right?
I think that's a really good point. Thank you for making it.
No, I mean, we see it, right? I mean, there's not enough of it to go around, and the demand, what it ends up is a race to the bottom, where you're basically just trying to out salary each other or out benefit each other to retain the talent, which I think is a race to nowhere. No one will win that, right?
I agree. I've often reconsidered my history degree in the past 10 years. So what is your primary goal at Eurosatory here? What is your mission?
Well, it's a demand. So it's a demand market, right? I think the defense market globally is going to hit like 2.4 trillion in the next few years. So it's a demand market. You get these hubs where you've got the full-on supply chains, the military customer here, the government officials here. It is in Europe, which is more seized than North America with the war in Ukraine, but not uniquely. So we're here to showcase Canadian firms on the world stage. It gives them an opportunity to come to a place where they can see, more than one country in one spot, right? So that's predominantly my role as the association president and as the host of the Canada Pavilion. And then as our own business, we're here to, we will be working on partnerships with some of the other show organizers around the world. We'll talk to COGE about partnerships and things like that, so that when we look at it from a NATO perspective, for example, we're sort of trying to row in the same direction, right? Where we're all not off doing our own thing, drawing companies to places where they can't make a critical impact.
I see. Okay, greater synergy. I think we were all for that.
That's a good idea.
So I suppose then, international partners are really key.
Yes.
Our alliances are key. General Bob Brown earlier, he mentioned that. Who are Canada's most important international partners at the moment? And perhaps at the same time, you could include a little bit of Canada's relationship with Ukraine, because I know that's developed quite extensively in the past few years.
It has. So it's obvious our largest partner is our neighbor to the south, right? The Canadian market, generally speaking, over 50%. Over 50% exports, 70% of that 50% is to the Five Eyes, and predominantly to both the U.S. first and foremost, UK second. So those are always tend to be our preferred partners. Also, being a part of the U.S. industrial base is very preferential for us. So we can park that, because we do that on a daily basis in North America. Here it is will obviously be our NATO partners and our coalition partners with respect to what is going on in the war in Ukraine. So As you know, Canada has one of the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the country. It was very important for Canada to be front and center and make contributions to the Ukraine. We made about $4 billion in contributions, which for our country is a lot because we're not a heavy defense nation in that respect. And we've signed up most recently to, I believe, almost all of the coalitions that are going on. So drones, armor, ammunition, flight training, you name it. We are on all of them. And about $3 billion just this year alone has been set aside for more contributions to Ukraine. So that's very important to us. We stepped out early in giving, as you and I were talking before this interview, we stepped out early to give equipment from our stocks. So we gave ammunition, rifles, EW, electro-optical, and things like that. And now we're into the industrial part. So we're working on armor, the APCs, and as well the light armor vehicles from General Dynamics Land Systems. So there's going to be a big wave of that hitting. But lately, we've been really working on that partnership. So we had, a couple weeks ago, we had 44 industrial partners and special operators come out of Ukraine to Canada to talk about the battlefield, to talk about the technology and the modifications we need to make for the battlefield as it evolves, and also to talk about partnerships to start to build that Ukrainian component in the Ukraine industry, because that's the next wave, right? The next wave is going to be the Ukraine cannot only rely on all of us to arm it. It needs to start either maintain, repair, and overhaul the equipment that's there, or secondly, start to develop some of its own. So putting that in place is incredibly important as well.
Absolutely, and I think Ukrainian users are very willing with their time and with their expertise.
Absolutely, it was quite something to see, and I was very struck by it because they literally 5 days earlier had stepped off the battlefield. So I guess why I was struck by it was like they were 20-something kids that looked quite hardened that were telling us the reality of what was going on with their drones on the battlefield, or how they were rationing their ammunition. And it was a moment when you just realize the context in which our business was operating, and the things we were worried about were so immaterial or so inconsequential when you looked at how they were trying to help us do better and deliver faster so that they could actually make headway in the war.
Well, I think that's a really strong note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Christyn. I hope you have a great show.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope the audience learned something.
I'm sure they have. Thank you very much, everybody. Some wonderful insights there into the need for synergies across our alliances, and the real importance of working together to drive development and make sure we don't duplicate effort. Thank you so much.